Hey, I'm TJ and welcome back to my channel where I'll be sharing with you technical insights and coding tutorials to help you on your coding journey. In this video, I'm going to be discussing with you the main difference between working at a tech startup versus working at a more established company. If you haven't already, make sure that you like this video and subscribe to my channel for more technical insights. Also, let me just give a real quick shout out to everyone that's been commenting below, letting me know that these videos have been really helpful in helping you to learn more about the tech industry while also helping you on your coding journey when it comes to learning how to code. Now, let me just give you a quick background before we start talking about startups and established company. So, when I was teaching myself how to code, I was living in Austin, Texas, where there were a lot of tech startups, and I spent a lot of time volunteering at different tech events. So, I got to learn a lot about startups. And ultimately, when I became a software engineer, I built my career working at tech startups. It wasn't until more recently that I worked at an established company that I really got to see firsthand the main difference between working at a startup versus working at an established company. So let's get into it. What is a startup, right? A startup is a company that is still in the early stages of development and has limited revenue and is mostly funded by seed money or just money from investors in general versus a more established company that is funded with the money they make from doing sales. Now, also, startups tend to be a lot smaller, typically less than 50 people, definitely less than 100 people. Just from my own experience, the first startup that I worked at had 5 people there. So when I joined, it became 6. And then after that, I went to another tech startup, and that startup had 11 people there when I started. And I was there long enough to see it grow from around 11 to about 50 plus people, and they probably have over 100 people by now. And then after that, I worked at a more established company that had hundreds of people there. And one of the main things that you'll notice about startups is that a lot of startups typically don't have HR departments. They typically have maybe like a 1 to 2 person HR team. So that's kind of really like a good way that you can tell if the company that you are working at is a startup or more so leaning towards established company. Do they have an HR department? Not a person or a team, but like an actual department. Moving on, startups also typically have less processes in place. There typically aren't a lot of like standard procedures that have been established in terms of doing things. You're kind of helping to create the rule book as you're there because you literally are helping to build the company. And that creates opportunities for you to wear a lot of different hats, which is good for you because that means that you can gain a lot more experience in a shorter time span versus working at a more established company where you might just be kind of pigeonholed into doing one thing or just working on one aspect of the product or whatever you guys are selling. And also, the pace of work tends to be a lot faster when you are working at startups because startups that are being funded by money from investors means that this company only has enough money to run or to operate for a certain amount of time before they have to focus on raising funding again. So anytime that a startup raises money, they typically try to get a lot of work done on a quick time frame so that they can make the most of that opportunity and ultimately try to get to a place where they are less dependent on raising money from investors to fund their operations and depend more so on using sales revenue. So the time frame in terms of the work that you're doing tends to be a lot shorter, meaning that you have a quicker pace of work. So you are doing a lot of work at a faster pace with shorter deadlines, which means that working at startups typically involve you working longer hours, and startups also don't usually pay as well either, and they try to compensate for that by offering you equity in exchange. So even though they pay you less, they offer you equity, which is kind of like a promise that, oh, this company is going to be successful and do well and IPO, or or be bought and acquired. And the equity in terms of the shares, the ownership shares that they are promising you that you are going to own in the company, those shares are going to be worth a lot of money if the company does well, is either acquired or IPOs. but the majority of startups fail. So definitely be careful when it comes to you analyzing the equity offers there compared with taking a lower pay. But now let's talk about more established companies. Established companies typically do not run or operate using money raised from investors. Established companies are typically companies that are operating and are funded by the money they make from doing sales, whether they are selling a product or a service. The money that they are making, their actual sales revenue, is typically what they are operating on. So these companies tend to be a lot larger and tend to have a more established space or presence in whatever field or market that they're in, versus a startup that's still trying to just claw for some type of like market share in the industry. Established companies have already established their market share and have that space carved out for themselves. Now, this also means that established companies tend to have a lot more processes in place, meaning that there are more standard operations and just kind of like ways of doing things that have already been established that you kind of have to follow, which ultimately means that established companies have more bureaucracy and red tape that you kind of have to deal with. You basically might have to go through multiple people just to get something simple done. Like, oh, let's say that my work laptop stops working, right? I might have to go talk to this person that has to get approval from that person that has to check in with this person. All of that just, I don't know. It's just weird to me. But at a startup, they would probably just buy me a new laptop that same day and boom, get back to work type thing. Okay. But at a more established company, the pace of work also tends to be a lot slower, right? So basically, one of like the main surprises when I left working at a startup and I started working at a more established company was I didn't really realize how fast and how quickly I was used to working, because when I got to the established company, they assigned me work to do as an engineer and I finished it like that day in like a few hours. I was done before lunch. And I was just kind of sitting there like, wait, hold on. This is the only piece of work on my plate. Like what's going on, right? So basically the work that would have taken me maybe like a day or two to do at a startup, at an established company, I pretty much had like 2 weeks to do the same amount of work. That was mind blowing for me, first of all, because I didn't really realize just how slow everything would be moving at that company, which also meant that I didn't realize how fast I was used to going working at a startup. So, yeah, established companies tend to have a slower pace of work, and that might be a pro or a con based on what you want and what you are looking for in terms of the company that you work for. Also, established companies tend to kind of pigeonhole you to working in one area of the product or just kind of working on this one feature, etc. Whereas at a startup, you get to wear a lot of different hats. But established companies tend to kind of pigeonhole you a lot more, which reduces the amount of experience that you are able to build and makes you a lot more specialized instead of building more generalized skill sets that you can use to try to figure out other things that you might like, and potentially you can even use that to help you pivot into other roles. So those are kind of like the things that you are giving up by working at a more established company. The fact that you might only get to just kind of work on one main thing and not really get the opportunity to work on something else unless you really fight for it. Also, established companies tend to have more regular work hours, right? Like anytime people talk about the typical 9 to 5, right, they are talking about established companies. And established companies also tend to have better pay and better benefits. Startups, they might offer you full medical paid for, maybe dental, but they typically don't have a retirement type setup for you guys in terms of a 401k. That's not really something that you find at startups. If you do, you're lucky. Shit, kudos to you. But startups typically don't have that. If you are looking for a larger benefit package, those definitely come with more established companies versus startups. So these are just some of like the main differences for you to consider when it comes to job searching. But if your goal is to break into the tech industry and kind of kick off your tech career, just in terms of giving very general advice without really knowing your background, your family situation, you know, the type of hours that you can put in, I would just recommend one that you apply to roles at both startups and established companies, right? Like this is really not the time to be trying to limit your options. The goal is to have more options for you to choose from when it comes to picking the right role. But I would also kind of recommend that earlier on in your career that you think about working at startups because that will give you the opportunity to gain a lot of experience a lot quicker, which you can now leverage to help you pivot to working at a more established company to get better pay, better benefits, and maybe even bigger responsibilities because the experience that you leave a startup with is just so much more valuable because working a year at a startup can sometimes be the equivalent to working like 2 to 3 years at a more established company. So keep that in mind when it comes to job searching. But just remember to always keep your options open first, right? Like, do not limit your options when you're job searching. Filter your options when you get offers. Okay? So those are just things to consider, and hopefully this has been helpful in helping you to kind of more so understand the difference between working at a startup and working at a more established company. And comment below if you have any questions.